The sun was setting over the dusty Texas plains when a lone rider appeared on the horizon. His hat was pulled low, his revolver rested at his side, and his eyes burned with something cold and dangerous. The man was John Wesley Hardin, a name that would one day echo across every saloon, jailhouse, and graveyard of the Wild West. People would tell stories of his speed, his temper, and the trail of bodies he left behind. Some called him a monster, others a misunderstood man in a violent time. But everyone agreed on one thing: no one drew faster than John Wesley Hardin. John Wesley Hardin was born on May 26, 1853, in Bonham, Texas. His father was a Methodist preacher, a man of faith and discipline. The Hardins believed in God, in education, and in moral living. But the world John was born into was far from peaceful. The Civil War had torn the nation apart, and in Texas, law and order were little more than ideas. Life was rough, men carried guns, and every argument could end in blood. As a boy, John was bright and quick-witted. He learned to read early, enjoyed school, and even wrote poetry. But he was also proud and easily angered. He hated being pushed around, and in the violent world around him, pride was often defended with a pistol. When he was just 15 years old, his life changed forever. The story goes that John got into a fight with a black freedman named Major Holzhausen. The argument turned violent, and Hardin shot the man dead. Whether it was self-defense or not, that single gunshot turned a schoolboy into a wanted outlaw. The sheriff issued a warrant, and John Wesley Hardin fled into the wild Texas countryside. He was only 15, but already the legend had begun. On the run, Hardin quickly learned how to survive. He rode from town to town, using false names and finding work where he could. But trouble always found him. He carried his gun like it was part of his body, and when danger came, he never hesitated to use it. In those early years, Texas was a lawless place. There were no fences, no telephones, and few sheriffs. Cattle rustlers, gamblers, and gunmen roamed free. To live, you had to be faster, smarter, and meaner than the next man. And Hardin was all three. Stories spread fast. They said Hardin could hit a coin in the air, shoot through playing cards, and draw his pistol in less than a second. Some said he practiced every morning until his fingers bled. Others swore he could sense danger before it happened. Whether the tales were true or not, they gave him a reputation, and that reputation kept men either far away or ready to test him. One night, while staying at a small inn, Hardin complained about a man snoring too loudly in the next room. The story says he fired through the wall and killed the man instantly. People laughed at the tale. Others shook their heads in disgust. But that was the image that stuck with him. The man who killed for the smallest reasons. The outlaw with a deadly temper. By his early 20s, John Wesley Hardin was one of the most wanted men in Texas. The newspapers called him the Young Killer. The Texas Rangers were always on his trail. But no one could catch him. He had friends and sympathizers in nearly every town. To some, he was a hero, a rebel standing against corrupt sheriffs and cruel soldiers. To others, he was a devil in human skin. Hardin himself didn't see it that way. He believed he was defending his honor. "I never killed anyone who didn't need killing," he once said. Those words would follow him for the rest of his life. But even outlaws grow tired of running. Hardin began to miss his home, his family, and the peace he once knew. Sometimes he would ride alone through the hills, thinking about the life he might have had. The preacher's son could have been a lawyer, a teacher, even a leader. Instead, he was a fugitive, with a gun that had spoken too many times. Still, he couldn't stop. Every town meant new enemies, and every enemy meant another bullet. By the time he turned 21, Hardin claimed he had killed more than 20 men. Whether true or not, those stories made him both feared and hunted. He drifted through Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, gambling, drinking, and always ready for a fight. Men followed him to test their skill, but few ever lived to tell the tale. The legend of John Wesley Hardin was growing faster than the man himself could control it. Songs were sung about him in saloons. Children whispered his name like a ghost story. And lawmen, every one of them, dreamed of being the man who brought him down. But beneath the legend, there was still a man, a tired, restless man, who sometimes wished he could start over. Hardin wrote poetry, read the Bible, and spoke kindly to children. Yet his past wouldn't let him go. The gun on his hip was both his protection and his curse. Every time he drew it, he buried another piece of his soul. The Wild West was changing. The railroads were spreading, towns were growing, and the age of the wandering gunfighter was beginning to fade. But Hardin didn't know how to live any other way. He had become part of the myth of the West, a symbol of freedom, violence, and tragedy. And as the wind howled across the empty plains, one thing was certain. The story of John Wesley Hardin was far from over, because in a land ruled by guns and courage, even the devil could become a legend. The year was 1869, and Texas was a land caught between chaos and rebirth. The Civil War had ended, but peace hadn't yet found its way to the dusty streets and cattle trails. Soldiers roamed without orders, outlaws ruled the roads, and the law was just a word that meant different things in different towns. In the middle of it all rode a young man, tall, sharp-eyed, and already carrying the weight of blood on his hands. His name was John Wesley Hardin, and the boy who once ran from a sheriff was about to become a legend. Hardin was barely 16 when he began living on the run. He found work as a cowboy on cattle drives, moving herds north along the Chisholm Trail. The long days under the Texas sun and the lonely nights around campfires hardened him, but they also gave him purpose and a chance to disappear into the vast wilderness where few men asked questions. Among the rough cowhands, Hardin found a new kind of home. They respected his quick reflexes, his sharp mind, and, most of all, his deadly aim. Every cowboy carried a gun, but Hardin's revolver was like an extension of his hand. He practiced endlessly, spinning, drawing, and firing until the movements became part of him. He could hit a target dead center while standing on a galloping horse. He could split a playing card at 10 paces. Those who worked with him said he never bragged. He didn't need to. His skill spoke for itself, and everyone who saw it knew. This was not a man you wanted to cross. But even on the open trail, trouble followed Hardin. During one cattle drive, a group of Union soldiers stopped the cowboys and began harassing them. They made cruel jokes, pushing Hardin and the others around. The young gunfighter tried to walk away, but when one soldier went for his weapon, Hardin's reflexes took over. In a flash, 2 shots rang out and 2 soldiers fell. The rest scattered. Hardin knew what that meant. Another killing, another manhunt. Once again, he rode hard into the wild, leaving behind a trail of fear and whispers. It was around this time that his name began appearing in newspapers. Small-town editors wrote about the boy outlaw from Texas, describing him as both brilliant and brutal. The more people talked, the bigger his legend became. In some towns, people said Hardin was a hero standing up against corrupt lawmen and Reconstruction soldiers. In others, they called him a cold-blooded murderer. But one thing was clear. Wherever John Wesley Hardin went, death wasn't far behind. He began moving under false names, sometimes Wes Clements, sometimes Jay Swain. He gambled, drank and drifted from saloon to saloon, living off winnings and quick draws. The Wild West was full of men trying to prove themselves, and many thought that killing Hardin would make them famous. But they underestimated the man they challenged. Hardin wasn't just fast, he was smart. He read people the way others read cards. He could tell when someone was about to draw, when fear flickered in a man's eyes, or when pride was about to make him do something foolish. In the blink of an eye, Hardin's gun would flash, and another man would fall. One story from this time tells of a card game that turned deadly. Hardin was winning, and another gambler accused him of cheating. The man stood up, his hand trembling near his belt. Before he could even clear leather, Hardin's revolver fired once. The gambler dropped where he stood. Hardin calmly gathered his winnings, tipped his hat, and walked out the door. But not every killing came from pride or gambling. Sometimes it was pure chaos. In one town, Hardin got into an argument with a local sheriff. Words turned to threats, and the sheriff reached for his gun. Hardin shot him dead in the middle of the street. The town erupted. Mothers pulled their children inside, and lawmen began forming posses. The chase was on again. As his body count grew, so did his fame. Newspapers called him the young Texas killer. Bounty posters with his face hung in every county. Lawmen swore they'd bring him in, but none could catch him. Hardin was always one step ahead, vanishing into canyons, hiding with ranchers who admired his courage, or blending in with cattle herds that stretched for miles. He lived fast and restless, always aware that death could come at any moment. Yet he seemed untouchable. Once a group of men ambushed him while he was riding near Abilene. They fired first, hitting his horse. Hardin hit the ground rolling and fired back 6 shots. each one hitting its mark. The attackers didn't get a second chance. Abilene, Kansas, was where Hardin's path crossed with another legend, Wild Bill Hickok, the famous lawman and gunfighter. For a brief time, they shared the same dusty streets, both men known for their deadly skill. Hickok tried to keep peace in town, but even he was wary of Hardin's temper. The two respected each other but kept their distance. It was said that in Abilene only a fool tried to outdraw either one. By his early 20s, John Wesley Hardin had become a name that inspired both fear and fascination. He was young, handsome, and deadly, a perfect image for a world obsessed with heroes and villains. Yet beneath his calm face was a man constantly running from ghosts, the faces of those he'd killed, the lawman on his trail, and the father who once preached about salvation and sin. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Hardin wrote poems in his notebook. He dreamed of peace, of a home, of a life without blood. But the West didn't forgive, and his gun was his only companion. Every town brought new enemies, and every sunrise meant another chance to kill or be killed. John Wesley Hardin was no longer just a fugitive. He was becoming a symbol of the violent world he lived in. His story was written in gunsmoke and dust, and it was only getting started. Because in the Wild West, fame came at the price of blood. And no one paid more dearly than the devil's own gunslinger. The legend of John Wesley Hardin was spreading faster than a prairie fire. From the saloons of Texas to the dusty trails of Kansas, his name carried a mix of fear, fascination, and disbelief. Every bartender, gambler, and drifter had a story about him, though most had never seen him. Some said he was the devil's own son. Others claimed he was a hero standing up against corruption. But the truth was simpler and darker. Hardin was a man shaped by violence, trapped in a world where survival came at the end of a revolver. By the time Hardin reached his early 20s, he had already killed more men than most soldiers did in a lifetime. He didn't brag about it, but he didn't deny it either. Each time he pulled the trigger, he told himself it was self-defense. But deep down, he knew that wasn't always true. Sometimes pride was enough reason. Sometimes a look or a word could seal a man's fate. Life on the run had hardened him. He no longer flinched at gunfire or death. When he rode into a new town, people would stop talking, eyes following him from the moment he walked through the door. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not arrogance, just the calm assurance of a man who'd faced death and won too many times to count. He wore his pistols low and loose, handles turned forward for a quick draw. His clothes were plain, dark trousers, a vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his sharp eyes. But it wasn't his outfit that made men nervous. It was the silence around him, the kind of silence that came before a storm. In the summer of 1871, Hardin found himself in Abilene, Kansas, one of the rowdiest cow towns in the West. Abilene was famous for its saloons, gamblers, and trail-hardened cowboys who rode in after months on the trail, pockets full of money and tempers running hot. The law there was Marshal Wild Bill Hickok, a man every bit as fast and fearless as Hardin himself. Hardin and Hickok met more than once. The two men shared a strange respect, a quiet understanding between gunfighters who knew what it meant to live by the draw. Hickok warned Hardin to keep his men quiet, to avoid trouble in town. Hardin promised he would, but promises meant little when whiskey flowed and guns were within reach. One night, after heavy drinking, Hardin returned to his hotel room. In the next room, a man was snoring loudly, so loud that Hardin couldn't sleep. In his frustration, he shouted for the man to quiet down. When the man didn't, Hardin, half-drunk and angry, fired through the wall. The man never woke again. The next morning, Hardin realized what he'd done. Wild Bill Hickok was furious. He swore to arrest him, but by the time Hickok reached the hotel, Hardin was gone. He had slipped out the window, saddled his horse, and disappeared into the darkness. That was the last time the two legends crossed paths. From then on, Hardin's reputation grew even darker. Newspapers printed stories about the man who shot a snorer, turning him into both a monster and a myth. Mothers told their children that if they didn't behave, John Wesley Hardin would come for them. Men in bars spoke his name in hushed voices, careful not to tempt fate, but not all saw him as a villain. In some parts of Texas, Hardin was viewed as a symbol of defiance. To struggling farmers and ex-Confederate soldiers, he was the man who stood against corrupt lawmen and Reconstruction officers who abused their power. He was the outlaw who fought back, Hardin himself seemed torn between both worlds, half outlaw, half folk hero. He believed he lived by a code. He didn't steal, didn't rob banks, and didn't hurt women or children. But he killed anyone who threatened him or questioned his honor. In his mind, he wasn't evil. He was just a man surviving in a cruel, lawless time. Still, the violence followed him everywhere. He drifted through towns like Comanche, Waco, and Corsicana, leaving behind a trail of fear. In each place, someone challenged him, and in each place, someone died. His speed with a revolver became legendary. It was said that Hardin could shoot 6 men before the first one hit the ground. As the years passed, the law grew more determined to bring him in. The Texas Rangers, proud and relentless, made Hardin their #1 target. Bounties were placed on his head, and Pazes were sent out to track him down. But he was too clever to be caught. He knew every back trail, every creek, every canyon. He could ride for days without rest, hide in plain sight, and vanish like a ghost. But even ghosts can grow weary. By 1873, Hardin had married Jane Bowen, a quiet, kind woman who saw the good still left in him. For a brief time, he tried to live a peaceful life as a rancher. He even stopped carrying his gun everywhere. Friends said he smiled more, laughed more, and seemed almost human again. But peace never lasted long for John Wesley Hardin. A bounty hunter recognized him near Comanche County and tried to arrest him. The man didn't make it back alive. Once again, Hardin was forced to flee, his dream of settling down shattered by the sound of gunfire. Each year, his world grew smaller. Every dusty town was another trap, every friendly face a possible betrayer. He couldn't visit family or stay in one place for long. The law was closing in, and the outlaw life was taking its toll. He had gone from being a boy with a quick hand to a man hunted by everyone, lawmen, bounty hunters, and even his own conscience. But through it all, one thing remained certain. John Wesley Hardin was a survivor. The more they hunted him, the more the legend grew. He was no longer just a man. He was a story whispered around campfires, a warning in every saloon, and as the West itself began to change, railroads stretching across the plains, new towns rising where wild trails once ran, Hardin became a symbol of the dying age of gunfighters, a relic of a brutal time, a man both feared and admired. But the West had one final chapter waiting for him. His luck would run out, his gun would fail, and his past would catch up with him. The law was coming. And this time, there would be no escape. By the mid-1870s, the legend of John Wesley Hardin had grown larger than life. His name was known in every Texas town, whispered in fear, shouted in anger, and written in every newspaper that loved blood-soaked headlines. Parents warned their sons not to test their tempers, saying, "Don't end up like Hardin." Lawmen used his name to frighten drunks into obedience. He was no longer just an outlaw. He had become a ghost that haunted the very idea of law and order in the Wild West. But ghosts don't live forever. And the Texas Rangers, the toughest lawmen in the land, were determined to prove it. Hardin's long trail of killings had finally caught the full attention of Captain John B. Armstrong and Captain Jack Duncan, 2 rangers who had spent years cleaning up the Badlands of Texas. They had seen killers before, gamblers, robbers, bandits, but Hardin was something different. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't after money. He was a man who killed out of pride, instinct, and survival. A man who lived by the gun and refused to die by it. While the Rangers studied his every move, Hardin kept running. He drifted from Texas to Louisiana, always staying a step ahead. Sometimes he lived under false names. Other times he hid in plain sight, working as a cattleman or gambler. He had friends who warned him when the law came too close, and enemies who wanted to collect the bounty on his head. The reward for his capture had grown high, $4,000 dead or alive. A fortune in those days. That kind of money could turn even the most loyal friend into a betrayer. Hardin knew that. That's why he trusted no one. He rode mostly at night, keeping to small roads and hidden trails. His revolvers were always loaded, his rifle tied to his saddle. He slept in barns, in forests, sometimes under the open sky with one eye open. Every sound, every owl, every coyote made his hand twitch toward his gun. The hunter had become the hunted. Yet in a strange way, Hardin seemed almost to enjoy the chase. The more danger that came his way, the sharper his instincts grew. He was clever, cunning, and bold enough to face almost anything, but even the sharpest man can't outrun fate. One day, While passing through Bell County, Texas, Hardin and his companions were ambushed by lawmen. Gunfire erupted and the air filled with dust and shouting. Hardin's horse reared as bullets ripped through the air. He fired back, wounding one deputy and killing another before galloping into the brush. The Rangers tracked his trail for days, finding spent shells and empty whiskey bottles, but never the man himself. Hardin was like smoke, always there, but impossible to hold. Still, the net was tightening. The Rangers knew his habits. They knew he loved gambling, whiskey, and women, and that his pride would always draw him into towns, no matter the risk. So they waited. Meanwhile, Hardin's world was collapsing. His wife, Jane Bowen, and their children were living in fear, constantly moving to avoid the law. He wanted to protect them, but he couldn't. Every letter he sent was a risk. Every visit was a chance of capture. The life of the fastest gun in the West had become one of loneliness and regret. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he wondered what it was all for. Was he born wicked, or had the world made him that way? He would think of his father, the preacher, and his mother's gentle prayers. Somewhere inside, that boy still existed, but he was buried deep under layers of guilt and gunpowder. In 1874, Hardin was cornered again near Comanche, Texas, by a group of Rangers and deputies. They caught him by surprise while he was playing cards. Shots rang out before anyone could even shout. Hardin dove for cover, fired twice, and escaped through a back window. He ran into the night, leaving behind dead men, and another bounty doubled in his name. The newspapers went wild. Headlines screamed, "John Wesley Hardin strikes again." Some said he had 9 lives. Others said he had sold his soul to the devil. But even devils have limits, and Hardin's time was running out. He fled east, finally disappearing for a few years. Rumors claimed he had gone to Florida or Georgia, living under false names. The Rangers never stopped searching. They shared his photograph, studied every report, and questioned every traveler who looked suspicious. Then one summer evening in 1877, a message reached Captain Armstrong. A man named J.H. Swain had been gambling in Pensacola, Florida. He was smooth, well-dressed, and carried 2 revolvers, one with ivory handles engraved J.W.H. Armstrong knew instantly. The chase was over. The Rangers boarded a train heading east. They waited until the night, when Hardin sat relaxed in his seat, unaware that death was walking down the aisle toward him. "Throw up your hands," Armstrong shouted. Hardin's eyes went wide. He reached for his gun, he always did, but Armstrong fired first. The bullet tore through Hardin's arm, spinning him in his seat. Blood splattered the train's wooden floor. The outlaw who had escaped death 100 times finally fell. The Rangers dragged him off the train, still alive but beaten. His reign of terror was over. After nearly 20 years of killing, running, and hiding, John Wesley Hardin was finally captured. When they brought him back to Texas, crowds gathered to see him. Men, women, even children. Some cheered, others cursed. Hardin stood tall, his arm bandaged, eyes steady. There was no fear in him, only a tired, quiet defiance. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for murder. The gunfighter who once ruled the West was now a prisoner behind stone walls. For the first time in his life, Hardin couldn't run. The legend had been tamed, but not ended. Because even inside a prison cell, John Wesley Hardin's story was far from finished. The world outside might have forgotten him, but he was already planning what came next. The devil with a revolver had laid down his gun, but not his fire. The iron gates of Huntsville prison slammed shut behind John Wesley Hardin with a sound that echoed like thunder. For the first time in his life, the man who had outrun bullets, pauses, and the law itself was trapped. The year was 1878, and the world outside was changing faster than he could imagine. Trains crossed the plains, telegraphs connected distant towns, and the Wild West he had once ruled was slowly vanishing. But inside those gray stone walls, time moved differently. For Hardin, every day was long, slow, and filled with silence. The clinking of chains, the creak of iron doors, and the heavy footsteps of guards became the rhythm of his new life. He had been sentenced to 25 years for murder, but for a man who had lived free and wild, even one day behind bars felt like an eternity. At first, he fought the prison life with the same defiance that had made him famous. He clashed with guards, refused orders, and carried himself with the pride of a man who still believed he was above it all. The other inmates watched him carefully. Some admired him, others feared him. Everyone knew his name. "That's Hardin," they whispered. "The killer from Texas. The devil with the fast hand." But pride alone couldn't break the walls of Huntsville. Weeks turned to months, months to years. The world outside forgot his face, but the stories remained. Hardin's legend grew even as he faded from public view. Newspapers wrote about him occasionally, calling him the tamed tiger and the prisoner who once ruled the West. Over time, something inside him began to change. The man who had once solved every problem with a gun now had no weapon, no horse, and no freedom. He had nothing left to draw on but his thoughts. For the first time in years, he had to face himself, not as a legend, but as a man. He began to read. Books became his new companions: history, law, and the Bible. He studied day and night, teaching himself words and ideas that were strangers to him before. He even began to study law, perhaps to understand the very system that had caught him. Other inmates said Hardin spent hours writing in notebooks, reflecting on his life. In one letter he wrote, "I have lived hard and fought harder, but a man must come to peace with his soul before the end." The guards noticed the change too. The wild temper was still there, but quieter now, buried beneath a layer of calm. He worked in the prison workshop, followed rules, and kept to himself. Some even called him a model prisoner. The same man who once killed at the drop of a hat now quoted scripture and offered advice to younger inmates who admired his strength. Still, redemption never came easy. Hardin's mind often wandered back to the world he left behind: the open plains, the smell of gunpowder, the thrill of danger. He dreamed of his wife, Jane, and their children growing up without him. He didn't know if they still thought of him as a husband and father, or just another outlaw buried by his own legend. He missed them deeply. In his heart, the preacher's son who once knew love and peace still lived, buried under years of guilt and blood. Sometimes, late at night, he'd whisper to himself the hymns his mother used to sing. For a moment, he'd almost feel human again, inside prison. Hardin began to write his autobiography, The Life of John Wesley Hardin, as written by himself. It was his way of taking back control of his story. In those pages, he painted himself not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man forced into violence by a cruel and chaotic world. He wrote about honor, injustice, and survival. Whether he believed it or not, no one could say for sure. But his words revealed something deeper. A man wrestling with his past, desperate to make sense of it all. As the years rolled on, prison became his strange kind of peace. He aged quietly behind bars, his once fiery spirit cooled by the slow passing of time. The guards who once feared him now treated him with a kind of respect. They said he carried himself like a man who had finally accepted his fate. But even behind walls, the old John Wesley Hardin never fully died. He kept his pride, his wit, and his belief that he was meant for more than this cell. When other inmates talked about escaping, he just smiled. "A man can run from the world," he said, "but he can't run from himself." By the time he had served 17 years, the world outside had changed completely. The Wild West was turning into towns and railroads. The age of gunfighters was ending. Law and order were no longer just words. They were becoming reality. Hardin was pardoned in 1894, after nearly 2 decades behind bars. The preacher's son, who had once been the most feared outlaw in Texas, walked out a free man. His hair had grayed, his body had grown thin, and the world he had once known no longer existed. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness, a small suitcase in his hand. Reporters rushed to see him, eager for a glimpse of the legend. Hardin stood tall, his eyes steady, and said quietly, "I have paid for my sins. I am done with the gun. The man you knew is gone." But even as he spoke those words, the world whispered differently. Some said the devil doesn't change, he only rests. Hardin soon began practicing law, using the knowledge he gained in prison. He wanted to prove he was a reformed man, ready to live peacefully. But peace was something that never came easily to him. The shadows of his past followed him like ghosts. He had walked out of prison a free man, but in truth, John Wesley Hardin was still trapped, not by bars this time, but by the legend he had created, and that legend was about to pull him back into the darkness once more. When John Wesley Hardin walked out of prison in 1894, he was a changed man, or at least that's what he told himself. The wind felt different after 17 years behind stone walls. The clang of iron doors had been replaced by the soft hum of trains and the chatter of growing towns. The Wild West he had once ruled was almost gone. The world had moved on without him. He was 41 years old now. His hair had begun to gray at the edges, his face leaner, his eyes deeper. He no longer carried the same fire of the young outlaw who once rode across Texas like a storm. But behind that calm gaze still lingered something dangerous, a quiet intensity that never truly faded. Hardin had learned much during his time in prison. He could read law books better than most, and he understood how justice worked, or at least how it was supposed to. So when he stepped back into freedom, he decided to start a new life as a lawyer. It was almost poetic, in a strange way. The man who once broke every law now trying to live by it. He passed the bar exam and opened his law office in El Paso, Texas, a dusty frontier town that was half civilized and half wild. It was the perfect place for a man like Hardin, someone too dangerous for peace, too clever for chaos. El Paso in those days was a city caught between two worlds. The railroad had brought wealth, but it had also brought gamblers, gunmen, and men looking to settle old scores. The saloons were still busy, the dice still rolling, and the pistols still close at hand. In that chaos, Hardin felt at home. He dressed sharp now, dark suits, clean boots, a silver watch chain across his vest. He walked with the confidence of a man who had faced death too many times to fear it anymore. People who didn't know his past saw only a respectable lawyer with piercing eyes and a calm voice. But those who did know whispered in the corners of saloons, "That's John Wesley Hardin, the killer turned lawyer." Don't cross him. At first, Hardin tried to live quietly. He took on small cases, land disputes, property arguments, minor criminal defenses. He was good at it too. His sharp mind and persuasive speech impressed judges and juries alike. The same charisma that once made him dangerous now made him convincing, but peace never fit him well. The old habits still called to him. The gambling tables, the whiskey, the thrill of danger. Every night after work, he would walk into the saloons of El Paso, nodding to the gamblers and gunslingers who recognized him. He'd play cards, drink just enough to loosen his thoughts, and tell stories about the old days, the gunfights, the escapes, the legends. The younger men listened wide-eyed. To them, Hardin was a living piece of history. Still, there were those who didn't see him as a legend, but as a target. Old enemies from his outlaw days began to reappear. Some wanted revenge. Others wanted fame by taking him down. Even the lawmen of El Paso watched him closely. A man with a past like his could never truly be trusted. It didn't take long before trouble found him again. One day, Hardin met a woman named Beulah Morose, who was living in town with her estranged husband, Martin Morose, a known horse thief. Hardin became involved in her legal affairs, helping her file for divorce. Soon after, rumors began to spread that he was seeing her personally. Whether it was true or not, it didn't matter. The gossip had started. When Martin Morose was shot and killed by local lawmen a short time later, people whispered that Hardin had something to do with it. Some said he had ordered the killing to clear his path to Beulah. Others claimed he had used his influence to protect the men who did it. Hardin denied it all, but the damage was done. The quiet lawyer's reputation was cracking, and the shadows of his past were creeping closer. By now, Hardin had started carrying his gun again. He said it was just for protection, but everyone in El Paso knew what that meant. The devil was dressing like a gentleman again, but he was still the same man underneath. He began gambling more, drinking heavier, and arguing louder. His temper, which had slept for years, woke up like an old beast. He clashed with local lawmen, especially Constable John Selman Sr., a grizzled gunman who had a reputation of his own. At first, their conflict was small, harsh words, cold stares, but El Paso was a small town, and grudges had a way of growing like wildfire. Selman's son had arrested one of Hardin's lady friends, and Hardin made it clear he didn't like it. He shouted insults at Selman in the saloon, calling him a coward. Those who saw it said there was something dark in Hardin's eyes that night, like the old days had returned for good. The townspeople began to whisper again, this time with fear. Hardin's gone back to his old ways. But in truth, it wasn't that simple. The West had changed, but Hardin hadn't. He was a man built for another time, a time when justice came from the barrel of a gun. Now surrounded by lawyers, judges, and rules, he was a relic trying to live in a world that no longer needed him. Every night he walked through El Paso, Hardin carried not just his gun, but the weight of his own legend. He was both proud of it and trapped by it. To live quietly meant to be forgotten, and to be remembered meant to live dangerously. And Hardin could never stand to be forgotten. By the summer of 1895, he had made too many enemies, said too many reckless words, and tempted fate one time too many. In the smoky glow of the saloons, people began to whisper again, not about his past kills, but about how his story might soon end. Hardin laughed it off. "I've lived through more gunfights than I can count," he said. "Ain't no man alive fast enough to take me by surprise." But as history would soon show, he was wrong, because in El Paso, revenge was patient. And someone was already watching, waiting for the moment when the great John Wesley Hardin would let his guard down. The devil had traded his six-shooter for a suit, but he couldn't escape the bullet that was coming for him. The summer of 1895 hung heavy over El Paso, Texas. The air was hot and dry, the kind of heat that made tempers short and whiskey taste like salvation. The town was alive with the sound of piano music spilling from saloons, boots scuffing against dusty floors, and laughter echoing into the night. Beneath the surface, though, something darker brewed. Men carried grudges like extra bullets, and one of those grudges was aimed squarely at John Wesley Hardin. For months, whispers had spread through El Paso. The once feared gunfighter, now a lawyer, was making enemies again. His words were sharp, his pride sharper, and his temper never stayed buried for long. He had insulted the wrong men, embarrassed others in public, and brought back the same old reputation that had haunted him all his life. The biggest of those grudges belonged to Constable John Selman Sr. Selman was an aging lawman, tough as leather, with his own violent past. He had lived by the gun too, and didn't take kindly to being disrespected. His son, John Selman Jr., had arrested one of Hardin's lady friends, and Hardin had exploded in anger. He cursed Selman publicly, calling him names no man could forgive. The tension between the two had reached its breaking point. El Paso was too small for both of them. On the evening of August 19, 1895, Hardin walked into the Acme Saloon, one of the busiest spots in town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where stories grew taller with every drink. The piano was playing, the laughter was loud, and the smoke hung thick in the air. Hardin was in good spirits that night. He played dice at the far end of the bar, sipping whiskey and trading jokes with a few friends. He wore a dark vest, his gold watch chain glinting in the light, and as always, his revolver rested on his hip. To anyone watching, he seemed relaxed, maybe even happy. But beneath that calm smile was the same restless soul that had followed him all his life. Across the street, Constable Selman Sr. was pacing. He had been drinking too, and his anger had been boiling all evening. Witnesses would later say he muttered to himself, "That man's done insulted me for the last time." Around midnight, he holstered his pistol, stepped into the street, and crossed toward the saloon. Inside, Hardin leaned over the dice table, laughing. "Double or nothing," he said, his voice carrying through the room. The dice clattered across the wood. A few men cheered. It was just another night for now. Then the doors opened. Selman stepped inside. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard as stone. He walked slowly toward the bar, his hand resting near his revolver. Some men saw him and froze. Others stepped aside, sensing what was coming. Hardin never saw him. Selman stopped behind him, raised his pistol, and fired. The shot echoed through the saloon like thunder. Hardin's body jerked forward, the dice spilling from his hand. He fell face first onto the floor, a single bullet wound in the back of his head. The great John Wesley Hardin, the fastest gun in the West, the man who had survived countless ambushes and shootouts, was dead before he hit the ground. For a moment, the saloon was silent. Then chaos erupted. Chairs scraped, glasses shattered, and men shouted in disbelief. Some ran for the door. Others stood frozen, staring at the motionless body on the floor. The piano player's hands hovered above the keys, unsure if the music should stop. Selman didn't run. He lowered his pistol, holstered it, and said quietly, "I just killed John Wesley Hardin." When the sheriff arrived, he found Hardin lying beside the dice table, his hat rolled away, his gun still in its holster. There had been no draw, no duel, no warning. The man who had outgunned so many had finally been caught off guard. Selman was arrested and charged with murder. Some called it justice, others called it cowardice. The newspapers spread the story like wildfire. Famous gunfighter shot dead in El Paso saloon. Crowds came to see the scene of the killing. Some wept, others laughed, and many just stood in awe that the legend was gone. When the undertaker prepared the body, he found Hardin still wearing his fine suit, the gold watch in his pocket ticking softly. The bullet had entered the base of his skull and stopped behind his right eye. Death had come fast, mercifully fast. At his funeral, few words were spoken. A preacher read from the Bible, the same book Hardin's father had once preached from. A small crowd gathered, including old friends, a few enemies, and curious townsfolk who wanted to see the end of a legend. The coffin was simple pine, and as it was lowered into the ground, someone muttered, "The devil's done gone home." But death didn't kill his story. If anything, it made it immortal. Within days, dime novels and newspapers were printing tales of his life. Some true, many exaggerated. They called him the deadliest man alive, the fastest gun in Texas, the devil's own gunslinger. Constable Selman himself didn't live long after that night. Less than a year later, he was shot and killed in a gunfight of his own. As if fate wanted to close the book on both men, for John Wesley Hardin, the end came not in a blaze of glory but in a single, unseen flash, a reminder that even the fastest gun in the West couldn't outrun destiny. Today, his grave still rests in Concordia Cemetery in El Paso. Visitors leave coins, bullets, and even playing cards at his headstone. Some come to pay respects, others come out of curiosity, but all come for the same reason, to stand over the resting place of a man who lived and died by the gun. In the end, John Wesley Hardin wasn't just an outlaw. He was a symbol of the Wild West itself, brave, violent, proud, and doomed. He lived fast, died young, and left behind a story too powerful to fade away. The dice had rolled one last time, and for John Wesley Hardin, they had finally come up snake eyes. The news of John Wesley Hardin's death spread across Texas like wildfire. Within hours, telegrams carried the story from El Paso to Austin, and by the next morning, newspapers all over the country were printing bold headlines. John Wesley Hardin, shot dead in saloon. To most people, it was the end of a dangerous man, the outlaw who had terrorized Texas for years. But to others, it was the birth of something much bigger. Death hadn't buried Hardin's story. It had immortalized it. The man who once stood on wanted posters was now being written into history books, dime novels, and campfire tales. The legend of the Devil's Gunslinger had only just begun. In El Paso, crowds gathered outside the Acme Saloon, peering through the doors at the blood-stained floor where Hardin had fallen. Reporters took notes, artists sketched the scene, and storytellers began weaving their own versions of what happened that night. Some said Hardin went down fighting. Others claimed he had been shot while turning to draw. In truth, none of it mattered. The story had already become bigger than the facts. Even the men who had known him couldn't agree on who John Wesley Hardin really was. To some, he was a ruthless killer who brought chaos wherever he went. To others, he was a victim of his time, a man born into violence, shaped by war, and consumed by the rough code of the frontier. He was a paradox, a man who read law books and quoted scripture, but also killed without hesitation. One of Hardin's old acquaintances once said, "He had the manners of a gentleman and the soul of a storm." And maybe that was the truth. Hardin was both sinner and scholar, preacher's son and outlaw, a man who could argue law in the morning and draw blood by sundown. After his death, his body was buried in Concordia Cemetery under a simple stone marker that read, John Wesley Hardin, 1853-1895. Below his name, someone later carved the words, "If he was ever wronged, he never forgot. If he was ever right, he never bragged." Visitors came from miles away to stand over the grave of the man who had become a symbol of the untamed West. Cowboys tipped their hats. Lawmen stood silently. Tourists picked up handfuls of dirt to take home as souvenirs. Even those who despised him couldn't deny his place in American folklore. In the years that followed, writers turned him into a legend. Dime novels and pulp stories painted him as a fearless gunfighter who faced down entire posses and never missed a shot. The truth was rougher, less romantic, but truth doesn't sell as well as myth. The people wanted heroes and villains, and Hardin was both in one body. Stories spread that he killed over 40 men, though historians later found the number closer to 27. Still, numbers didn't matter. In the public imagination, Hardin was a symbol of an era, the embodiment of the violent beauty of the Wild West. Ironically, the law career he tried to build before his death made his legend even stranger. The idea of a killer-turned-lawyer fascinated people. It made him more than just another outlaw. It made him human. A man capable of learning, changing, and yet still falling back into the darkness he could never escape. Historians still debate what drove Hardin. Was it pride, anger, a twisted sense of justice? Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe the Wild West itself was to blame. It was a place where life was cheap, and a man's worth was measured by his aim. Hardin didn't create that world. He was simply born into it, and he learned how to survive in it better than most. Yet even in survival, there was tragedy. For all his skill, Hardin never found peace. Every time he killed, he lost a little more of himself. Every town he left behind carried another piece of his soul. In his final years, when he practiced law and spoke of redemption, he might have truly wanted to change. But the West had a long memory, and so did fate. The irony of his story still echoes today. A man raised by a preacher, named after a Methodist founder, who became one of the deadliest gunmen in American history. Modern historians call him a product of his time, caught between the old world of honor and the new world of law. Filmmakers, writers, and songwriters still use his story as inspiration. He appears in Western novels, movies, and even country songs. His life has been retold so many times that it's hard to separate the truth from the legend. Some say his ghost still walks through El Paso, restless and defiant. Locals claim to have seen a shadow near his grave at night, wearing a black hat and silver belt buckle, waiting for one last duel that never comes. But maybe that ghost isn't a spirit at all. Maybe it's just his legacy. The restless memory of a man who refused to die quietly. More than a century later, people still ask the same question. Who was John Wesley Hardin, really? A monster or a misunderstood man? A killer or a survivor? The answer depends on who's telling the story. One thing, though, is certain. Hardin lived and died by his own code. He never begged for mercy, never asked for forgiveness, and never claimed innocence. He faced life the same way he faced every gunfight. Calm, fearless, and unblinking. And perhaps that's why his name still lingers. Because John Wesley Hardin represents something raw and eternal in human nature. The battle between law and chaos, good and evil, pride and redemption. The West may have buried the man, but it never buried the myth. Today, his grave stands as both a warning and a monument, to the dangers of pride, to the cost of violence, and to the strange immortality of a man who lived too fast to ever be forgotten. As one old cowboy once said while standing over Hardin's headstone, "They'll tell his story long after we're gone. The man's dead, but the legend's still drawing breath." By the time the dust settled over John Wesley Hardin's grave in Concordia Cemetery, the Wild West itself was already fading into history. Railroads were cutting through the plains, telegraph lines stretched from coast to coast, and towns that once feared gunfights now had mayors, sheriffs, and schools. The era of outlaws and frontier justice was ending. But somehow Hardin's story refused to die. Instead, it grew. The newspapers that had once called him a murderer now called him a legend. Dime novel writers turned him into something larger than life. A man faster than lightning, sharper than the devil, and impossible to kill. In the hands of storytellers, the outlaw who once slept under bridges and ran from posses became a hero of the American imagination. It was strange, even ironic. The same society that had locked him in prison now celebrated him as a symbol of rugged freedom. Maybe that was because Hardin represented something people didn't want to forget. A time when men lived by their own rules, when courage, pride, and skill meant more than law or wealth. He was the last breath of the untamed frontier, a man who belonged to an age that was already disappearing. As the years passed, people started asking not, who was Hardin? But what did he represent? To some, he was a symbol of individualism, a man who refused to bow to anyone. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a brilliant but doomed soul who couldn't escape the violence of his own making. And to many Americans, he became the template for a new kind of hero, the anti-hero. Before movies and television, There were stage shows and traveling storytellers who brought the legends of the West to life. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show had made characters like Annie Oakley and Wild Bill Hickok famous. After Hardin's death, his name began appearing in the same breath. He was the outlaw who was too clever for the Rangers, too quick for his enemies, and too proud to beg for mercy. He was both feared and admired, something that made him unforgettable. In time, his myth began shaping America's idea of what it meant to be Wild West tough. Hollywood would later build entire genres around men like Hardin, the stoic gunfighter who lived by a personal code, the loner who stood against the world. In every cowboy movie and every lone hero riding into the sunset, there was a trace of him. But behind the legend, the real Hardin was far more complex. He wasn't just a killer or a symbol of rebellion. He was a man torn between two worlds, the moral world his father preached about and the violent one that ruled the frontier. That tension between righteousness and rage, law and lawlessness, became part of his myth because it was part of America itself. The United States, in the late 1800s, was still finding its identity. It was a nation of pioneers, dreamers, and drifters, a place where people made their own luck, sometimes with their hands, sometimes with their guns. Hardin's story fit perfectly into that dream, even if it came wrapped in blood and tragedy. By the early 1900s, authors and historians began to dig deeper into his life. They uncovered his writings from prison, especially his autobiography, The Life of John Wesley Hardin as written by himself. In it, he tried to explain his actions, not with excuses, but with a sense of twisted logic. He wrote about growing up in a world of injustice, about fighting to survive in a land without mercy. His words revealed a man who understood his sins but couldn't undo them. The book fascinated readers. It made them see Hardin not just as a gunfighter, but as a thinking man, a killer who read Shakespeare and studied law. He wasn't mindless violence. He was intelligent chaos. That blend of intellect and brutality made him even more fascinating to future generations. Over the decades, his name appeared in songs, novels, and even Hollywood films. Western stars like Clint Eastwood and James Coburn would later play characters inspired by men like Hardin, men who lived by their own code and carried both guilt and pride in equal measure. Tourists still visit his grave in El Paso. They leave behind coins, cards, and bullets as offerings, as if trying to connect with a piece of the past. Local guides tell stories that mix truth and fiction until no one can tell which is which anymore. Some claim Hardin's ghost walks the cemetery at night, tipping his hat to anyone brave enough to visit after dark. But maybe the real ghost isn't haunting El Paso. It's haunting the way we tell stories. Hardin's life became the blueprint for America's fascination with the outlaw hero, men who break the rules but live by a higher sense of justice. That archetype, born from men like Hardin, still lives on today in every movie, book, and song about rebellion. He also helped shape the darker side of that myth, the idea that freedom can come at a terrible cost. His story reminds people that independence without restraint turns into destruction, and pride without mercy leads to downfall. He lived free, yes, but he also died alone, shot in the back, his dice still rolling across a barroom floor. That's the contradiction at the heart of his legend. He was both the dream and the warning, the hero and the villain, the living embodiment of America's struggle between freedom and control. If you listen closely in the quiet deserts of Texas, where the wind moves through the dry grass like whispers, you can almost hear it, the echo of hooves, the faint click of a revolver, and the sound of a man's voice saying, "I never killed anyone who didn't need killing." Those words, both haunting and unapologetic, became the final piece of his myth. John Wesley Hardin may have died in 1895, but the idea of him, the outlaw, the survivor, the man who stood against the world, never did. He became part of the story America tells about itself, that sometimes the line between good and evil isn't a line at all. It's a shadow cast by the setting sun, stretching long over the frontier, and standing in that shadow is the ghost of John Wesley Hardin. More than a century has passed since John Wesley Hardin fell to a single gunshot in a smoky El Paso saloon, but his story still refuses to fade. His name lingers like a ghost across the plains of Texas, whispered in history books, sung in country songs, and immortalized in stories told by old men around campfires. He has become more than a man or even a legend. He has become a mirror, reflecting the wild, restless spirit of a time when law and chaos rode side by side. The Wild West was never about clear heroes and villains. It was a world built on contradictions. Outlaws could be gentlemen. Lawmen could be killers. A man could carry a Bible in one hand and a revolver in the other. Hardin fit perfectly into that contradiction. He was the preacher's son who turned into the devil's gunfighter. His life was proof that morality and madness often shared the same saddle, and yet, for all the death and destruction that followed him, people are still drawn to him. Not because of what he did, but because of what he represents. He was a man who refused to be tamed, a man who lived on his own terms, for better or worse. In an age that demanded obedience, Hardin embodied rebellion. In a land that promised freedom, he lived that promise to its dangerous extreme. If there's one thing that makes his story timeless, it's that it speaks to something deep in human nature, the struggle between freedom and control, honor and pride, justice and revenge. Hardin walked that line his entire life. Every choice he made carried a price, and every victory pushed him closer to his downfall. He reminds us that freedom without conscience can destroy a man. That courage without mercy can turn into cruelty. That pride, when left unchecked, can consume everything good inside a person. Historians often ask, was Hardin truly evil, or just a man trapped in a violent time? The answer lies somewhere in between. He was a product of a broken world, raised in the shadow of the Civil War, where violence was as common as sunrise. He grew up believing that to survive, he had to strike first and think later. That belief made him feared, but it also made him hollow. In his final years, when he studied law and tried to live a quiet life, there was a glimpse of what could have been, a man who might have used his intelligence and charm for good. But destiny, or perhaps his own nature, had other plans. His past never stopped following him, and his pride never stopped leading him into danger. When we remember John Wesley Hardin today, it's not just for his gunfights or his body count. It's for the tragic beauty of his story. He was a man born in chaos who searched for peace but never found it. A man who carried the best and worst of human nature in one heart. Every Western movie, every story of the lone gunslinger who walks a dusty trail with a haunted past owes something to Hardin. He became the blueprint for the flawed hero, the one who can't escape his own legend. The character who wants redemption but is too scarred to find it. The man who, deep down, knows that he belongs to a dying world. Even now, if you visit his grave in El Paso, you'll find offerings left by strangers, coins, whiskey bottles, playing cards, small tokens to honor a man they never knew but somehow understand. Some come for curiosity, others for respect. But all of them feel the pull of that strange duality, admiration and warning, awe and pity. Because John Wesley Hardin's story is really about us. About the part of every person that wants to live free, to make their own choices, to stand unafraid in the face of the world, even if it means standing alone. But it's also about the cost of that freedom. Hardin's life is a reminder that rebellion without purpose and pride without forgiveness can lead only one way, toward destruction. The West was tamed. Towns were built and laws were written, but men like Hardin never truly disappeared. They live on in every restless soul who refuses to be told what to do, in every heart that still beats faster at the sound of a revolver's click, and in every dream that begins with the words, "Once upon a time in the Wild West." When we look back at the Wild West, it's easy to romanticize it, the open plains, the gun duels, the code of honor. But Hardin's story pulls back the curtain. It shows us the truth behind the myth, that the West wasn't just freedom and adventure. It was blood, fear, and loneliness. And yet, maybe that's why it still fascinates us, because it reminds us that even the darkest stories can shine a light on what it means to be human. In the end, John Wesley Hardin didn't just leave behind tales of violence. He left behind lessons. About pride, about consequence, about the thin line between justice and revenge. He lived fast, he fought hard, he died suddenly. But his story endures, because it captures something timeless about the American soul. The hunger to live free, the refusal to surrender, and the tragic truth that not every man built for the frontier can survive it. As the sun sets over the plains of Texas, and the wind carries the sound of an old tune through the grass. One can almost imagine the echo of hooves fading into the distance. Somewhere out there, in the endless horizon of memory, rides the shadow of a man in a black hat, a revolver at his side, eyes fixed on the setting sun. John Wesley Hardin, the man, the myth, the lesson, and though he's long gone, the legend still rides on.